So they preempted this building, which was completed about 12 months ago, the Urban Workshop in Lonsdale Street in the city. This this came really a long time ago. This project was nearly 6 years ago, but it was a long time in the making. But it came out of a really interesting aspect of our client was allowed to develop this site if they paid $3 million for an archaeological dig, because it was seen as the most important archaeological place in Melbourne, and they were allowed to do the development as long as they actually provided Museum Victoria to do a 6-month archaeological process. That gave us time as architects to work alongside them, and as old street patterns from the very first settlement of Melbourne occurred, we reworked all of our ideas for the bottom of the building to actually recreate the patterns of the old streets. So here was the map as they carefully, the archaeologists tore back the old car park that was built there in the 1950s and found the plans of this very early part of Melbourne's settlement. What was, I think, really interesting about it, that they worked for 6 months, not one thing of major interest was found, but 350 things of fascinating minor interest were found. And in their agglomeration, they became a really wonderful cross-section through the understanding of life at that time. It was quite interesting because at one stage they found oysters there, and they thought, oh wow, this predated all European settlement. It was an old Aboriginal site. We've actually found a midden, until they found out they were Sydney rock oysters. In fact, it was the old Bordello district of Melbourne, and oysters were the staple foodstuff. And that'll come back into this talk. So an understanding of history. So a street that had been lost to Melbourne even beyond memory was Little Leichhardt Street. Well, it was known to exist, but it was never quite sure where it was. So we found out exactly where Little Leichhardt Street. We actually shifted our lift core so that it became a building on Little Leichhardt Street. We did this and placed everything around it, even the words Little Leichhardt Street in this progressive stretch, this elastic stretch, actually then pronounced this link through from Lonsdale to Little Lonsdale Streets. And so here's our yellow diagram, so we're charting the course through this excavation process and reaffirming this building's place in the city. Now, of course, this is all to be internalised, so we wanted to feel as much like a street, so we kitted our client, a vast trade union-run superannuation fund, to build really what's a very civic aspect to it, the foyer. And so we pulled out all the floor plates above, which then created the need for all these bridges and everything over this civic street. So there's our stretched lettering rendered in local stone for Little Leichhardt Street. There's the building, it's a big side core building, tower. And then we wanted to had a series of ideas for how it would engage with the street and creating this new laneway. So the idea of a front living room where we'd slow down the passage of activity into the lift core and demand people to stop and slow down, take a coffee and sit there pressed again like we've enforced university students and families to do in the past. This new vast population, these 3,000 people who inhabit this building, to sit forward of going up into the lift and being lost up in the netherworlds of the building and sit right on the street in this area with this operable louvered facade right on the street. So here's where we've paired the building back. We've incised the building's program open, which necessitated all of these bridge links to create this civic street. We retained all of the old buildings bar one. We only had to hold 3 of them. We actually held, I think, 7 old buildings on the site to make it even more difficult. So again, at night time, this engagement, this level of transparency through into the underworld, the bridges, it's in all of our model making. So even the bridges don't run straight. We wanted to actually pair them open and get view lines up and see as much activity as we could into the building. Right at the end of it, I was just going down to our, in your terminology, wee batches in Tasmania on a Friday, and people were starting to move in. And we recreated one of the old historic street edges. We actually replaced all of the old basalt here, but of course people were falling over it and they already had their first threatened legal case within minutes of the building opening. So I'd been at them for ages. Could we design some furniture? And there was a firm no. And they quickly yelled out, quick, design out something, anything that'll stop people falling over this little step edge. So I went down to our place, and there's an ancient old fax machine there, did these sketches out of our favourite material, plywood, and then leather for these funny seats that you can sit on one side, but they actually arc up so you can actually put an elbow on the other side, and they became our devices for stopping people falling over. So eventually we actually got our furniture that we so wanted to provide. And then the bases of columns, these massive 2-metre diameter columns. We did timber versions of them that sat down as other seating devices that created this new other secondary living space in the building. So then we'd actually cut open the core, so it gave us, obviously we'd created an unnecessary problem that we had to solve, and we solved it by looking at the sorts of materials that come out of our residential architecture. Solid timber. Commercial buildings are always full of sort of black granite and timber veneer and stainless steel. We wanted to have, so it's out of basalt, which is the local indigenous material, solid timber. Then we've etched into the solid timber so people could be assured it is solid timber. You look in and see that 25mm depth of it, and then other surfaces up through the building. So coming back, one of the last things that was designed, the building was well into design development, and we thought, what can be the architecture of this great civic meeting space at the front of the building? And it was just one day I happened to see this, I hope, yes, this, which was a cross-section through the lift cores. Now, the lift cores are this structural heart of the building, these massive cores that are like the trunks of these trees in the urban forest. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. If you get that interesting diagram, which is all about the counterweights and the running gear and so forth, and actually slice it and render it horizontally, it can be as if one of these vast limbs has fallen to the earth and being guillotined at the street frontage. So it became then this shape, and so we then exaggerated it, made these vast coffers that actually extend out and become the architecture of this space, and then rendered in the cheapest materials, so offcuts of Victorian ash, timber versions at the bottom for this collective area. So it's by far, rather than having a whole lot of B&B and casino, very expensive lounge suites that next to nobody wants to sit on, this is rudimentary holiday house sort of furniture at the bottom of the building. But what it really is doing is completing the diagram of these lift cores, and then providing us with this sort of some of the fine details as we hold it off the timber core and so forth. We've since designed a small cafe in there. And a laneway. I better rush now because I've got too much still to show you. A laneway. There just weren't enough, so we actually created a new laneway for Melbourne, which our wonderful client allowed to be built. And here it is with a bridge spanning across it. And at this stage, when we took these photos, the tenancies weren't in place, but it's a new retail laneway full of streets and shops, and a vast courtyard at the back, so a public point of assembly. At this point, we wanted, so often modern buildings are lost up in the upper worlds as they hit big podiums. We wanted a point where you could actually walk up and touch the facade. So there's this one point where the facade, 34-storey facade, comes down and actually hits the ground and appears to bounce. How we should engage with the character of the historic streetscaping behind. Here's one of Melbourne's, in fact, I think it's Melbourne's oldest hotel. It had been delicensed 100 years ago, but they've now relicensed it. It sits on the corner of this lost laneway. So there's all of Melbourne's old hotels and the laneways have their chamfered corner, the 45-degree corner. There's our contemporary version of this broad chamfered corner, but in glass, so it reflects the old building opposite. And then cutting through, so there's a shadow line, and so at the height of all these old 18th century buildings, our facade comes down and folds around, but holds clear of that alignment. And working with an artist, a really good friend of mine, Rosalind Pickett in Melbourne, she curated this sort of artwork with all of the shards of materials and made stories around the oyster shells and the plates and the belt buckles and the dead cats and everything else that they found out of there into this amazing, wonderful poetic artwork. And when mixing up real history with pretended history, with invented history, so there's these vast glass vials that contain air, modern air, in amongst these wonderful old artefacts.